what I learned in writing Age Like a Girl, that estrogen stimulates dopamine. And so when estrogen levels decline, your dopamine levels can follow. And one of the recommendations that I make in the book, and I've seen work in my own life, I've seen work in fellow postmenopausal women, is you got to switch it up. You've got to, and one of the recommendations I give in the book is like change your routine. Is if you don't have kids at home, like this is something my husband and I did. We were eating dinner at like 8 o'clock at night, because the kids would get home from all their events, and now I'm like, we could eat at 5. Let's eat at 5.
Early bird dinner.
And like, it was so exciting. It was so exciting. And so like, it's funny how I love the way you're looking at that, because you're mapping it from a different direction, which is you're trying to move them out of a safety center. And my explanation is I'm trying to give you a little more neurotransmitter you may have lost, but they're both getting you to a really cool new spot in your brain.
It's so true. And interestingly enough, while those that are in that kind of circle of complacency space, when they're doing their pattern opposition work, they need to actually learn how to take more intentional risk and actually learn how to build up the ability to be committed, to maybe have more courage to get through something without immediately labeling it as a failure, and instead to actually build some emotional resilience, some self-regulation tools. Because that was one thing that I didn't quite mention, is the left side tends to be much more self-regulated. And if you look at it as a child, and this is an oversimplification, but in essence, if you can't trust your parents, I have to learn how to manage this on my own. So any hardship, it's not, your brain doesn't tell you that it's safe to go crying to mom or dad. You have to learn how to manage it on your own. Yeah. On the right-hand side, because there is that inherent or implicit parental trust, you're much more likely to go bringing all of your problems to your parents. But then you actually learn that I can only navigate through something if I co-regulate. So then when your parents are gone, what happens? I mean, this is where people can get into relationships that they shouldn't be in. They can maybe find their dream guy or gal, and all of a sudden they're acting like, maybe a stalker, which I've seen, because as soon as they have a need, or as soon as they're in any sort of turmoil, they have no ability to self-regulate. So they're acting out. Maybe they're texting their partner 100 times and they're like, hey, I was in a meeting. Like, you have to learn to navigate through this. So that is what happens if you don't learn how to do that when you're a child. Yeah. Is that reflex is so strong that I'm in need. The people on the left, we either have dissociated from our needs, detached from our needs, right? To your point, having a need is not productive and therefore not safe. Agreed. So you maybe personally, more so than maybe the second cluster that I was telling you about on the right, we probably on the left are more aware technically of what we actually wanted, but we've kind of pushed that away or sectioned it off because it doesn't really get a chance to live or thrive right now. Right. Whereas the people on the right that have kind of more that lack of self-preservation instinct, they don't even know what they ever needed, because all they know how to do is think about what other people want them to do instead. Whereas on the left-hand side, we're aware of that need, but only in so much as we need them to kind of keep it together as from our side as either a mediator or peacekeeper. So it's less that we care what they actually think and more that we care that we can keep them de-escalated. Yeah. Yeah.
It fascinates me because I've witnessed my own rewiring with the loss of hormones. And it's literally like I feel like somebody shook me and said, hey, I want to show you why you do what you do. And it was really revealed, and I think many women, it's revealed through irritability. The number one sign or symptom of menopause is not hot flashes, it is irritability. And so where I got curious is the irritability because you don't want to keep believing these thoughts, you don't want to keep working this way. And yet I haven't found a solution for like, hey, this is what you do when that shows up. So can you talk a little bit about if somebody's really resonating with this conversation, how do they dive deeper to rewire themselves for the better?
The first step is always brain pattern mapping. Brain pattern mapping takes about 20 minutes to do. You can do it in your own home. We map 200 historical data points, and your aggregate responses from those 200 historical data points are what actually predict the brain pattern type. The brain pattern type is made up of 9 markers. This is something that I know when we did the podcast swap, we talked about something that I refer to as the neurocognitive funnel. in essence, our perception of reality is going to influence our emotional state and our behavior, and you can't ever get around that, which is why I've always thought it was interesting that so much of therapy is trying to treat behavior at the level of behavior. It would be like telling somebody who's addicted to heroin, like, just don't go buy heroin. They're like, well,
Right.
I mean, is it that simple? No, not really.
Yeah.
So we have to understand fundamentally how the person's perceiving reality and that sort of distorted perspective or lens, because that's going to influence how they're actually defining their world. So when we look out at our world, really, it's just a bunch of pixels. And based on these scientific experiments, we've kind of jumped the gun and we're deciding what each of these pixels mean, which is why you and I, although I don't think we're the best example of this because we'd probably both like similar people, but let's say we pick someone on the far right side of the spectrum. We could go into a meeting and maybe you and I are sitting on one side of the table, they're on the other side, and we're interviewing somebody. We could all leave that interview. You and I might love the person. Their like assertiveness and their passion. We were like, yes, I can get behind that. Like I resonate with that. That doesn't intimidate me.
I love those
Maybe
people.
the person, I know, same. That's why I was like, this is going to fall apart really quickly because we're too similar. So the person on the right, let's say right side of the brain pattern spectrum, they were sitting across from us. The meeting ends. We all sit down like, so what did everybody think? That person could actually have been triggered by the same exact qualities. So where we saw assertiveness, that person might have seen ego. Where we saw passion, that person might have seen narcissism. So that just shows us that really how we perceive reality is where we absolutely have to focus the bulk of the work, because what do you do with something like that? Is one person telling the truth and one person's lying? No, the reality is there are certain qualities that if you just look at the data, like if you and I were just looking at it from a hiring perspective, even though it might have triggered the person on the right-hand side, objectively, our decision to hire that person would have likely resulted in better performance. Whereas that person being triggered by that person be like, I don't like them, we need to look for another candidate, that actually could have impacted their bottom line. But a lot of people can't get past that self-deceptive lens. So the first two markers that we look at in brain pattern mapping, it shows us their unique pattern of distortion with how they see the world around them. And that those two primary markers are going to plot them on the brain pattern spectrum. Then we're going to be seeing three markers that show us how your emotional state changes based on early transitional and late stage behavior. Because what we perceive is going to dictate how we're defining, and what we're defining is going to dictate how we respond emotionally. And there is this baton passing effect that happens, and we just keep repeating the same thing over and over again. Somebody who's very anger prone doesn't all of a sudden magically become a people pleaser, although based on your body of work, perhaps maybe they could at 40, but we will continue to dig through that one.
Right, exactly. You let me report back.
Yeah, you report back. We will continue this conversation. I feel a long-term study coming on, so we'll.
That's what I did too.
I'm so excited.
Yeah.
So in the context of, let's think of, someone's dad, for example. Like I had a dad that had a temper that was very quick. He could, accidentally not think of a stop sign was coming, and all of a sudden if he has to slam on his brakes, he's dad barring me and screaming at all of us, where I'm like, we didn't even literally do anything. That was just a stop sign. That was all you, buddy. So some people are just, their protective response is absolutely anger. Another way to look at this would be kind of like the fight, flight, fawn, freeze, flop. Some people fight, some people fawn. You and I are definitely more at the fawns. But there are also the flights, there are the flops, there are the freezes, right? So how your body is going to kind of act out biochemically your protective response, that is very patterned. And we often start one way and then move the other. So example would be some people fawn and then they fight, right? They have to get themselves trapped. Then they like feel imprisoned. They're like, no, do you even know who I am? And then they try to free themselves, right? That's kind of more my pattern historically. But then you have those that they fawn and then they freeze, right? They stay there and they stay stuck and they never try to save themselves. They never maybe experience anger, which is something that arguably when they hit menopause, all of a sudden that irritability might be their
That's what I think.
Their hall
It's
pass
like it all,
to freedom.
Yeah. Yes.
So those three things that we track are the early stage transitional and late stage emotional responses. So that's tracking more the biochemical domino effect, if you will, that's happening in the body. Then the last four markers are, again, early stage transitional and late stage behavior, because behavior is going to flow downstream from emotion. emotion's going to flow downstream from perception of reality. So when you actually pull this whole system together, which anyone that does brain pattern mapping will actually see a schematic when you meet with somebody on our team to go through it, it very much functions like a system, right? So kind of like planets in an orbit. We have kind of those top 2 markers, the 3 in the center and then the 4 in the bottom, and they all kind of do this like pendulum swing domino effect where one really is triggering the other, and it's kind of moving through the system that functions like a cycle. So with break method, that's always the first step. There's no way to get it wrong per se, right? Because a lot of the questions, they are based on historical data. So it's not like, so tell me how you feel about your mom, which for what it's worth, I think is one of the biggest misses in therapy right now that I think we're starting to bump up against, is that because of this whole brain pattern problem, people aren't able to accurately self-report. So then you get yourself into a situation perhaps with couples where you're like, as a therapist, I mean, which one's lying, which one's telling the truth? Like if I buy into like if this person's telling the truth, then this, right? So you get yourself into this sort of gray area where really, I think therapists often can't actually get past their own brain pattern to see that information objectively. And I've seen so many marriages almost destroyed by couples therapy come to break method, where I really front and center try to save as many marriages as I can by being like, hey, listen, the data is going to tell us the story. If we follow the data, we're going to get to the other side. Many of you won't like what's going to happen along the way, but we're all going to get to the other side together. I usually refer to break method as a program as committing to being a rat put in a maze. Because in a traditional therapy setting, especially now in 2025, your preference somewhat gets to dictate where you go and where you don't go.